All right. Well, my name is Cassy Dorff. I'm an assistant professor at Vanderbilt University. I run the OPSC, the Online Peace Science Colloquium, with Brad Smith, who is also at Vanderbilt University. And the OPSC started in 2015. It is a part of the annual meeting of political science, the annual meeting of the Peace Science Society. And really our mission is to try to celebrate the research that happens both before and after the conference and bring that research to a wider community, as well as help researchers develop their papers and projects together as a group. So today we have Gary Uzonyi or Koren, who will be presenting the political origins of rebellion, which is their great paper, which I believe will be posted online. This talk will also be posted online in the Peace Science website. And we have three excellent discussants. You can all wave. We have Kathleen, Cunningham, and Jessica Maves Braithwaite, and Jeanette Lewis. So thank you so much for your time, all of you. It's really great to be here together, and I look forward to this discussion. We'll go ahead and have the authors begin their presentation. You'll have about 15 minutes, and then we'll turn it over for discussion as a group and go for about an hour.
All right, is that up there?
Looks
so
good.
Great. So thank you, Cassy and Brad, for having us on. Thank you to our discussants for being willing to read this paper and provide comments, especially during this coronavirus, which I know is causing a lot of stress. And thank you to everyone who might log on and take a look at this paper. So what you're seeing here today, The Political Origins of Rebellion, is a paper that Orr and I began working on as we were reviewing what we thought was kind of the dominant strand of thought when it came to where we see rebellions occur. This idea that we have aggrieved groups who look for opportunistic spaces within a state that challenge the government. This kind of idea goes back to Farron and Layton. We see it more recently with Carter et al. This idea that groups are going to go into rough terrain, into mountains or jungles, out into the periphery, away from the government's reach, away from government capacity, to begin their rebellions. But as we were reading these literatures and we were considering different cases, what we noticed was that a number of groups were actually forming in urban centers. And in particular, they were forming in the capital city as well. And so when we dug into the data a little bit further, the Forge data, we found that about 30% of all civil wars form in urban environments. And while peripheral conflicts or rural rebellions are the majority, they're only about 50%. The other 20% actually are formed by groups who leave their home country and come back in to fight the government. So we started with these urban rebellions in kind of constructing this puzzle we had, which is, given the higher cost of forming in areas of high government capacity, why would rebels do this rather than go out into the periphery as expected? And what Orr and I endeavored to do is think about or theorize on the mechanisms that might not only explain urban rebellion, but might connect them more broadly to the formation of rural or foreign rebellions as well. And so what we did is we draw on research by Stanlin, Larson, and Lewis, Parkinson, right? This idea that rebels are political organizations, right? They're similar to rebel groups in that they have constituencies, political machinery, and they don't care just about power, but also about policy. And so we have this idea that these constituencies shape in part where these groups are going to form, right? There needs to be both supply and demand. So supply of the political machinery that connects these constituents to the policy process, and then also demand for these particular brands of politics, right? So for us then, government capacity is going to play little role in the formation of these groups, where it might play a role in other stages of the Civil War. And so from this idea then of rebels responding to constituents as a type of political organization, we have these implications then that groups are going to form where their core supporters are located, where this political machinery is located. So for example, if you have urban constituents, you're going to form in urban areas, even if that's the capital city in the heart of the government's capacity. So before we get to discussing this idea a little bit more in an analysis of our hypotheses, I just want to set out two scope conditions briefly. The first is that the point of this paper as constructed currently is to illustrate that political constraints shape rebellion. So we don't have information on all the different groups that thought about forming a rebellion, right? And so what we're doing is working on with those groups that did ultimately fight the government and thinking about, well, why did they begin their conflicts where they did? So we're kind of drawing on Weinstein's approach to thinking about groups in that way. Also, what we really want to highlight in this work is that the formation of rebellion is different than the onset of fighting or contestation. So we're backing up a little bit further than where many papers start, from onset to the formation itself. So to get there, right, again, we come to this idea that war is politics by other means, that rebels are political organizations that want political change. They have policy goals. And you have political entrepreneurs that build a constituency and build political machinery that helps them push towards those policy changes, even if some of those tactics they use are violent. And so for us then, in thinking about these different groups and where they originate, what we want to think about is, well, where are these constituents? Who are they? And why might they push rebels to take certain strategies rather than others? Now, we think that the politics of rebellion help explain other phases and different tactics used throughout the war. But here what we want to do is think about which groups, in a sense, map onto certain constituents and thus locations. So what we're going to do is consider 5 group types in this paper. 3 of those are going to be ones that we think drive urban formation. 1 of those will be foreign formation, and then a final one to be rural formation. So what we're going to have then are 3 hypotheses built around these 5 different groups. And so here what I'm going to do is just start talking about the groups that we think drive a lot of the urban rebellion formation. So first we begin with military-based groups. These are groups that form out of the current regime's military. So importantly, many of these rebel leaders tend to be junior or senior officers. These are officers that then tend to be stationed in barracks that are located either in key cities or the capital city itself, as these are the cities that the government really wants to protect, right? The military is the last line of defense for these different countries. The thing is that militaries, though, have their own interests, right? They're bureaucracies with their own preferences, in which these junior and senior officers are responding to some of the demands of other soldiers in their barracks. And so if they become dissatisfied with politics and look to challenge the regime, they're going to dig in from where their constituencies are located, right? In these key barracks, in these urban areas or the capital city. We also consider social interest-based groups. So we're not talking about social movements. What we're largely talking about are interests like education or labor. So we're thinking about students and workers, youth groups, and unions, right? And what we point to is that cities, and the capital in particular, tend to be economic and educational hubs for our country. So workers are coming to be where the industry are. Students are coming to be where the educational opportunities are. And so the scaffolding exists in these locations that should some of these groups wish to challenge the government, they're not going to then leave the city and go out into the periphery to come back, but rather they're going to build on those structures that are already in place. And lastly, when it comes to urban rebellions, we also consider political-based parties. So these are parties that are involved with legal politics, where since most politics occur in urban areas and in the capital, these parties have developed machinery to connect their constituents to these levers of formal politics. So even if a group has rural constituencies, it needs to build that machinery to be successful in the political sphere. Right, so if you think about the Republic of Congo that saw a number of civil wars in the early 90s, we kind of can trace this logic. So the ninjas, for example, were a group that represented an ethnic group in the rural region of Pool, and yet they're forming in the capital of Brazzaville because that's where their machinery is. That's where their core activists are located. And so what we want to do is compare these urban rebellions to the other types. So for example, foreign rebellions. Here, what we're thinking about are largely refugee-based groups, individuals who are unable to avail themselves of the protection of their government, tend to cross an international border while they're living in these refugee camps or other sites. You have political entrepreneurs working within these communities, trying to build a constituency to go back and challenge that original government that pushed them out. So we can think about Charles Taylor and how he went throughout refugee communities in West Africa, trying to build up the NPFL before going back into Liberia. So again, we have foreign rebellions accounting for about 20% of our observations, urban rebellions accounting for about 30 of those, and then the other half tend to be rural rebellions. And again, the idea is that you have ethnic groups that tend to be in these rural areas, and that's what gives them the opportunity in the periphery. We want to push back on that a bit to focus on how or what constituency groups tend to be located in rural areas specifically. And what we think does a lot of the work here are actually splinter groups. So this is where the opportunity factor of rebellion comes in during other phases of the war. So when rebels form, whether they form in rural areas or urban settings or abroad, they challenge the government, and they tend to be much weaker when they do so. And so the government can force these groups out into the periphery. So when you get forced out into the periphery, what we tend to see are that rebel groups have factions that become dissatisfied with the existing rebel movement, right? And they break off and they form their own splinter to challenge the government. So where are they breaking off? Who are their constituents? Well, they're breaking off in these peripheral areas with other rebels who are dissatisfied with the way in which the original political entrepreneurs were pursuing policy change. So if you think about Sierra Leone, right, you have the AFRC, which forms in Freetown, it gets pushed out into periphery. We see the West Side Boys splinter off from them up in the rural Okra Hills, north of the capital before coming down. So I think that largely sketches out the idea there. So we have these three general hypotheses that we test by looking at all the rebel groups in the forged data, where the unit of analysis is the group itself. The dependent variable is going to be these different areas in which the group can form. The explanatory variables are going to be the 5 group types we just mentioned. And largely, we're going to control in these base models for what we think are the main confounders, the relative strength of the group relative to the government, trying to capture opportunity, and then whether or not this group has an ethnic base, thus capturing this idea that ethnic groups are the ones rebelling from the periphery. So if you take this base model and you look at the first different effects, what you can see is that there's going to be support for each of our hypotheses. Military based groups, social interest based groups, and political party based groups are the ones that tend to form in capitals. When we move to thinking just about large cities, so here urban centers of 50,000 or more populations, we see it's the military and the political parties that continue to drive these results. When we turn to formation in foreign countries, again, it is this refugee or exile community that gives rise to these rebellions that come back into the country. And lastly, when you look at the formation in rural areas, we find it's not the ethnic groups that are giving rise to most of the rural formation, but rather it's splinter groups that's really capturing the variation here. So we've conducted a number of sensitivity analysis. You can read those up there. I won't read through each of them, but I do want to bring your attention to kind of the last few in which we've really thought about some endogeneity problems that may creep up in this research design. We're happy to talk about those more in the in the discussion. And lastly, different ways to think about the relationship between these different potential formation areas. So large cities that are capitals or things like that. So just wrapping up here, what we're largely trying to do in this project is bring back this old idea that war is politics by other means, which means that rebel groups, even if not formal political parties, are trying to engage in a political process. And so we're trying to draw these parallels between rebel groups and political parties and other political organizations, thinking about how constituencies shape preferences, how constituencies and political machineries build certain strategic considerations for the group beyond grievance and opportunity. So again, we thank you for your time and giving us feedback about this particular paper and how we might develop it into a publishable unit, and also maybe expand beyond the paper itself here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And thanks for staying nicely on time. Beautifully done. So let's go ahead and take some comments from our discussants, and we'll start with Kathleen and then move on to Janet.
Okay, great. Well, I'm happy to join you here today, and I'm not just saying that because I get 1 hour locked away from my children, but that is playing a small role. I really enjoyed reading the paper. It was fantastic to see some work on origins. You know, Jessica and I think this is a understudied and really important part of the formation process. I'm so happy to see Janet here. Her work, dissertation, and the subsequent really inspired a lot of our thinking about origins and sort of how these things happen. So I'm really happy to be here and talk about the paper. I am going to send you comments, sort of more detailed, but I don't want to get in trouble with Cassy, so I'm going to stick to some big points now, and really oriented towards publication. So I read this as essentially as if I had gotten it for review. A few things, most of what I'm going to say is about the framing and the theoretical setup. I can't possibly criticize the data. I'm going to let Janet do that. Maybe Cassy. Let me talk a little bit about the framing and the theory. So I love the idea for this paper, and I really like the way you presented the puzzle to us today, where you talked about urban insurgencies. And I think that the way the paper is currently drafted, this focus on an introduction to the greed and grievance debate, really kind of puts us back 15 years. So I think there's a much more compelling way to engage this the literature and to put your argument into it. What I would recommend if I were a reviewer on this paper would be to have an alternative introduction where essentially you start with a few prominent, well-studied peripheral cases and identify sort of how these have skewed our approach to understanding rebellion, right? There's sort of an over-focus on the rural. And I think that's a relatively easy thing for you all to do because you already have that orientation in the paper. And I think you can add to that, a straight acknowledgement of Sons of the Soil had a huge impact on our understanding of rebellion, but it doesn't really match what you're seeing in terms of the formation of rebellion in a lot of interesting cases. So you would kind of start with showing us where we've gone awry historically, as opposed to entering into the greed and grievance debate. And then I think you are sort of engaging the state capacity literature as kind of a second foil for the paper. And I think you could bring those things together by saying, because we focus so much on these rural insurgencies, because this played such a big role in our thinking, particularly policy-oriented work and thinking about sort of policy making around rebellion, that it led us to this extensive focus on state capacity, which I think you're correct about, right? That this has been something, and you can look at stuff like the failed state projects and sort of draw on what happened in the policy community related to ungoverned spaces. And I think you're absolutely right about sort of how we got to this place. And so I think that's kind of an alternative way to frame the paper and to bring us into your argument. Now getting to your argument and trying to stick on my time constraints, I think at this point, I can see the theory as bringing in a couple different literatures. You're talking about political parties, you're talking about the politics of rebellion. but I'm having a hard time grasping your exact narrative as it runs through the paper and your central argument. And so I wanted to kind of bring up a few questions for you that I'm hoping will kind of get us to some discussion about that. The first point I would suggest is that in the introduction, which I recommended that you change, but this may be the same, rural and weak and urban and strong capacity seem to be conflated. And you're identifying some literature related to urban politics, but as a conflict scholar and as somebody who's worked a lot on rebellion, I didn't grasp exactly why I should believe that states have such low capacity in the center. And I wasn't really sure if that was part of your argument. So I think some distinguishing about whether you're actually going to make an argument about capacity, or if capacity is just something you're presenting your argument next to say, you know, we need to think about this differently. I would love for you to elaborate on the rural versus urban constituencies, and to really delve into why these are really different. So you do this in part in your hypothesis generation process. You have you know, a set of factors you think are likely to be relevant to urban constituencies. But I thought you could really delve into like the literature on rural rebellion, some of the older work on that, which you cite, but then doesn't play a big role in the theorizing, and maybe about urban recruitment. Again, you know, a lot of this is in the paper, but I wasn't sure exactly how it was fitting into your argument. So bringing together what I think is your core argument about urban and rural constituencies and really making a strong case for that as your central point. Okay, another potential way to direct the paper, to think about the paper that I would find compelling would be if you could show us the difference between formation location and how fighting happens. To me, this would be like a great a hook to lead people into the paper, and also to show how important it is that we consider formation. So for example, and I'm making up these numbers, you know, if 30% of rural fighting groups actually originated in urban centers, that would be super interesting. So maybe like hitting on that distinction that you're making a little bit more clearly, I think elucidating the difference between formation and fighting location would be something that would really bolster the sort of credibility of why you're doing this and the contribution. And then let me just say one more thing about the theory, and then I'm happy to talk about other stuff after the other discussants. We can have discussion about that. This argument that you know, you're sort of introducing a theory of rebellion as politics by other means, or sort of returning, or I think in the paper you said bringing politics back in. I found this not as compelling as I wanted it to be. I think it actually kind of covered up your argument about the different constituency types. And so I think you can have that as sort of the foundation that you're working on, but I really think that, you know, talking about rebels as political organizations is not controversial. It actually made me think that you were going to make a distinction between criminal organizations, which was not part of the paper. And so I think some of that way that you presented it masked what your central argument was. So I'll kind of stop there, and happy to hear other thoughts.
Great, I'll pick up from there, and just add that thanks for having me and inviting me. I've been thinking about similar issues and learned a lot from this paper, and knew I would also learn a lot from these fantastic discussants too. So thanks for having me as part of the conversation. And I really like the paper. I think it's a really promising paper, and I think it really forces us to think about, you know, precisely how internal armed conflict comes about, and also the, you know, potentially like multiple pathways to armed conflict onset, and of course the sort of overlooked category of conflicts that start in the urban areas, which I hadn't thought as much about. And so I learned a lot from that. And I'll just say that, you know, for what it's worth, also from the little I have thought about that, and just from the empirical work of the paper, like I like the core findings about, particularly about military, social interest, and political party-based groups forming in urban areas. That made a lot of sense to me, both in terms of the logic and the empirics. But yeah, there are a couple areas I'll mention where, if I were a reviewer in particular, I would focus on. So I love the data you use. I think so the Forge data is an amazing new resource. So thanks to Jess and Kathleen for creating it. But my first set of comments is just about sort of using it in a careful way, or just particularly being sure that you are really careful about your wording, about the knowledge that we are gaining from it, and particularly the way that you're using it. Because I think actually, like, stepping back, Gary, you mentioned in your comments that, you know, one of the issues with the paper potentially, or sorry, maybe it was or before we started recording, sorry, was about the descriptive, that the contribution is, a lot of it is descriptive. And I think that, like, the conflict literature is really ripe for some descriptive contributions, and particularly about urban pathways to conflict onset, because we haven't had a lot of that. Like Stanlon had that great piece that pointed out, and some other, that this is something that occurs, right? But we're ready for some descriptive contribution that pushes it further to really understand those processes, and also puts into context how widespread they are. And so I just want to key in on that piece about how widespread it is. So, right, so, and the core point I just want to make is to be a little more cautious and precise about your wording. So, for example, like in the abstract, you talk about the surprisingly large number of groups that form in urban areas, which you know, I think is, I buy, given how much literature has focused on rural rebellion. But in particular, you know, you have this really important descriptive finding that more than a third, I'm quoting here from page 2, of all rebel groups form in large urban areas. And I think that third number is really important, but I think there's really good reason to believe that that's an upper bound on the number of rebel groups. And I think actually just the way to get around this is to say, among rebel groups in the UCDP PRIO that made that threshold for that data set, because if I remember correctly, the Forge list, right, is based on that list. So, or maybe it's among groups that, and I think this is how you characterize it in your presentation, but among groups that go on, you know, to cause civil wars, or, you know, however we want to characterize that 25 battle death threshold, right, then a third formed in urban areas. And that, to me, is worthwhile, because even the authors of these data sets, the UCDP and PRIO, UCDP PRIO Armed Conflict data set and the Forge data set, I think neither of them would say that they were aiming to capture every single armed group that formed. And I know that even in the Armed Conflict data set, when they talk about missing data, right, they acknowledge that they're more likely to miss groups in poorer countries, right, that have larger rural areas, right, and of course, and going back further, they're more likely to miss rebel group formation. And some of my own digging on this topic suggests that, right, and would make some sense, right, because we're all relying on newspaper articles to code these rebellions. Of course, we're more likely to miss rebel group formations in rural areas, right? So there is some selection bias here that is in favor of having, right, or you have a sample that is more likely to be capturing the urban group formation than the rural group formation. And this is really an issue just because you sort of need the population of rebel group formations to make that characterization of all rebel groups that formed, and we don't quite have that with this data. But again, this is not a huge point, but to the extent, like, and I think you can still make the case, right, that we have overlooked a lot of cases of urban group formation, and it's certainly enough it's frequent enough to be worth understanding, right? But I would be skeptical that a third of all rebel group formations occur in urban areas because of the way that we generate that data. And I would also just urge you, maybe a nice way to sort of grapple with this point is back in Kalivas's sort of classic 2006 book, he has his second chapter, which is, you know, a sort of a kind of a lit review or lit critique article on pathologies. He has a nice discussion of urban bias in the way that civil wars are captured. And it also calls it political bias. And so, you know, he's critiquing primarily historical accounts of rebellion and civil war, but it also has a lot of echoes for newspaper analyses. And I think that engaging that directly could be a nice way to head off some of the critiques in this direction, to the extent that people, right, I mean, Fair and Lane 2003, like they're pretty smart guys, and right, they're asserting most of this happens in rural areas, right? And so I think you just want to be pretty careful about, again, won't belabor the point anymore. This is clearly a really important contribution, and we need to understand the range of Civil War onsets, but to not sort of overstate the case there, I think would be important. Turning to the theory, and this is just going to echo a couple of things that Kathleen said. The main thing I just wanted to know a little bit, I overall really like the theory, but I wanted to know a little bit more about this issue of what formation is, how it's different from violence, and in particular, so I like and I'm intrigued in this discussion about constituents, but what happens if I have sort of your mental model right of what's happening, you have effectively nonviolent groups, but then there's a moment where they decide to become violent, and they're still in urban areas, and they need constituents in that phase, and often or sometimes they then get pushed out into rural areas for much of the violence. But that left me wondering, I mean, as Kathleen said, how often does that happen? Would be really interesting to know. But also, how much time passes? If you can tell us more about how, does fighting usually start happening right away, and therefore are we really talking about violence in urban areas? That's one thing. Or is there some, incubation process that's happening in urban areas? And if so, what is happening with the constituents in that phase? And I think that would really help fix ideas, clarify a little bit about your core concepts in your theory. So that would help me a lot. But it would also and if it's, I think that would answer a lot of the other questions that I would have. Cassy, how am I doing on time? I forgot to time myself. Should I wrap up here, or do I have time for one more point? One more point, okay. And so I'll just say, and lastly, I'll just wrap up with saying that I think that you could also, so illustrating some of this with your case studies, you have several nice case studies in your appendix. In my view, those would really help also sketch out some of these processes, right, and show them. And I would argue for bringing some of those in the paper. And if you needed to cut somewhere, in my opinion, the last two hypotheses could be broken into other papers, right? They're sort of revealing different dynamics of rural rebellion. And I would stick to the first three hypotheses and illustrate them in the paper with your case studies, but drawing out to some of what I was just referencing about the details of the processes. And the last point is just, if the violence usually doesn't happen until they're in rural areas, I would worry about that a little bit, or at least I would want to see some substantive motivation about why we should care about these phases that happen before violence happens, since violence is the thing we usually worry about. So you may have that already in mind, but I would love to understand that a little bit better. Thanks a lot.
Awesome. So I've had a chance to read this paper earlier. So I loved the changes, some of the developments. A lot of my comments are going to be a little bit more nitpicky and things that I'm still curious about. And then also kind of building on some themes that Janet and Kathleen have raised. So I'm going to reorder comments because some of what Janet just talked about is relevant to some maybe more minor points, but curiosities that I still had about the ways that you were using and building on Forge, and potentially maybe some extra things that you could look at. So I think this point about kind of groups, what population we're using is really important to consider. Janet's work highlights that UCDP is actually going to be missing quite a lot of organizations that are still using violence, but didn't quite necessarily make that battle death threshold. And especially when we're talking about formation, we're talking about formation of groups that eventually go on to, sometimes very quickly, sometimes it takes years to get to the point where they make it into UCDP in the first place. So kind of thinking about that process, one of the questions that I still have is kind of what because I haven't actually, I'll admit, I haven't really used or looked at the location data. That was just kind of one of those like, oh, we should probably collect this and maybe someone will use it and make it more refined, which is super exciting to see someone doing that already. So I don't really know what the missingness on location looks like. I'll admit that. I don't know kind of which groups were missing, if that's systematically missingness across smaller groups that are only fighting low intensity conflicts, if there are groups that are likely to be in more rural areas, as Janet suggests, if they're systematic across types of parent organizations. So like, do we actually not know much about where refugee groups are forming exactly or something like that? That's probably not right. But I also was curious about how you're dealing, because I do remember that we have pretty vague information on some of the locations. Like, it formed in this province, and I don't know if it formed in a urban area in that province or a rural area in that province. So I was wondering if you delved into some of those cases a bit more and coded some more of that information, and if so, maybe we should like combine efforts, and for the next iteration of Forge we can have more refined information on formation location. So having a little bit more discussion about what missingness looks like, and maybe, I mean, if you guys collected some more data, like, you can kind of toot your own horn there and like let us know that you've done some more digging, because I was just kind of curious how you dealt with some of those more vague location pieces of information that we provided. And then kind of also thinking about this, the way that the data is used and kind of what might be missing or treated differently here. I was curious when you're talking about rebel parents in particular, so like thinking about splinter groups, are you aggregating the UCDP parents, like, so the rebel parents, and then just the other armed groups that are not fighting at a level that's high enough to be in UCDP? Because I'm wondering if a lot of those other armed groups that are not rebel parents in the data set are oftentimes like terrorist organizations. They're oftentimes fighting in urban areas. So if we're thinking about where the parent organization is, I wonder if some of those armed groups are actually more urban based. And so a couple of suggestions here: if you are aggregating the two types of like violent parents, violent non-state parents, splitting that out a bit and just looking at UCDP parents, and then the other armed parents, that's kind of a catch-all category that might need some more nuance. If anybody's looking for a research project, you could code that a bit more if you wanted. But I also wonder about active versus defunct UCDP rebel group parents. We have a variable in the data that's the splinter UCDP that talks about whether the parent organization is still fighting. And so I wonder if defunct rebel parents might be less likely to have urban rebels that grow out of them, because the group might have disbanded already and not necessarily still be fighting in those rural areas. So some ways to kind of play around with that a little bit more if you keep this in the paper, or maybe that's something that you explore more in a separate project, as Janet has suggested. So if you split that out and explore the origins of rural insurgency a bit more that way, then I think you could do that. I find this story much more compelling. So I now can't remember if we talked about this in this video or if this was something we talked about earlier, but I think this could be a standalone article, like original research article. I think if you're doing the spin-off, like, let's look at rural insurgencies and splinter groups themselves, that might be a bit more of a research note. I don't know that that's as compelling, but I think there's a lot of novelty that you could play up here. So I would encourage you to kind of work on this as a original article. Cass, am I doing okay time-wise? Time for, okay, cool. Two more things, and they're I think fairly quick. You're talking about the constituencies of these groups, and I find that really interesting and important to consider. But I think there's maybe two types of constituencies that are getting conflated in the way that you're talking about them. I think you have your organizational constituency, which is what you're really talking about here, and then you might have a broader constituency that the group is trying to appeal to, like an ethnic constituency, or if it's like a populist group, it's like peasants or something like that. So like the example you brought up of the ninjas, that like they're an ethnic, their ethnic constituency is the pool ethnic group, but that they're forming in an urban area because that's where the party is based and stuff like this. So I don't know if you need to kind of parse out or be a little bit more careful in the language of what you're talking about in terms of a constituency, because I think groups probably have multiple constituencies that they're trying to appeal to and to engage. And so maybe you have like this process by which you have an initial urban formation where you use parent organizations to get things up and running, and then you move out to rural areas where you have a broader base where you can recruit within an ethnic group or something like that more concretely. And on that point, the ethnic group, so I'm curious too about the ethnic variable that you're using, because you had mentioned that only 5% of groups have an ethnic tie, which I don't feel is right. So I'm thinking that maybe you're using the pre-org F variable, or like the ethnic parent organization variable. And that's really just like a catch-all for groups that didn't have a formal parent organization, but had some sort of ethnic constituency. So there are a ton of groups that have ethnic constituencies that we didn't code as having an ethnic parent community because we had specific parent organizations that were formal named organizations. So if you had an ethnic group that was your constituency, but you formed out of a political party, maybe a political party that was an ethnic party or something like that, your parent organization is the political party, not the broader ethnic community. There's a different variable in the data set that's just, I think it's ethnic. And that's an indicator of whether the group formed from an identifiable, like explicitly formed from and catered to an ethnic group. So that's the one, if that's not, that has many more observations that are coded 1 than 5% of the observations. So if that's not the one you're using, I would use that one, because I think that's probably a better representation of what it seems like you're trying to get at there. Or using other ethnic variables that other people, like the EPR data and things like that. And then finally, I'm just gonna like a big picture question. And this is something that I'm kind of curious about both times that I've read this paper. I'm wondering if the support base is dictating the location of formation, the constituency base, whatever we want to call it, or if actually the location may be where some individual rebel entrepreneur is dictating the type or types of parent organizations that we're seeing for these rebel organizations. And this is probably, again, kind of a more qualitative deep dive into even further into how these groups form, which is like, is this an organization that is upset about something? Or is this an individual that is like, I'm unhappy, I want power, I'm gonna find whoever is close to me that I can mobilize. And so I'm gonna use this political party because I'm based in a city center or something like that. I don't know if this matters. Maybe this doesn't matter. Maybe it's kind of like the location driving the parent organization, or the parent organization driving the location, doesn't matter. But I don't know, it's something that just kind of keeps sticking in my mind of like, I'm kind of curious about this. Maybe these are different processes, but anyway, so that I think.
Thank you so much. These are awesome comments. I think we could just stop now and these guys could have hours of things to talk about. But since you cannot break into a huddle without probably breaking Zoom, why don't you just respond to anything big picture that you want to keep talking about? You're welcome to make clarification responses, but I encourage you to not try to go back through all of that. So Gary or either one of you.
Or do you want to begin with anything?
I have a couple points. I mean, do you want to, so like, I mean, those are really, really useful comments. I mean, I think some of them we have kind of talked about, other ones not. I mean, I think, I guess one of the questions I would have to the group is, do you think that this paper should really focus more just on urban groups, and then we move really, as I think Janice suggested, we move the other two, or maybe, I mean, we move the other two hypotheses and just really focus on the urban kind of formation specifically, and then go into much more of this detail, or something that is a bit more about those political origins? Because from what we're getting here, it seems like the political aspect is actually less interesting than the urban and details related to kind of the urban formation. And again, this is kind of a way of maybe combining those, and I'll kill Koren, and kind of like the new coming of urban rebellions, which we saw in the 70s as well, which we never see those urban rebellions. Well, that doesn't mean that urban areas are not important. So the question, I guess, like one of the questions I would have is whether you think we should really just focus this paper on the urban aspect, which is kind of where we came from originally. And then based on people's feedback, we kept expanding it more and more toward those other aspects. So, you know, I mean, that would be one question I had. In terms of the, so
let's go ahead and answer that. Yeah.
Yeah, let me
go
just,
ahead.
I mean, I have a pretty strong feeling in support with Janet. Like I found the refugee hypothesis to be almost tautological because they by nature have to have a foreign formation because they're refugees. We didn't encode internal displaced people. And I think that the dynamics of splintering are nuanced and sort of more thoroughly examined in other studies. And so it wasn't, those two hypotheses seemed much less compelling and interesting to me. And then if you focus just on the urban-rural distinction, I think you can do, as Janet and Jessica suggested, you know, a deeper dive into the formation processes and how they might differ in those different areas, and also give us a little bit more of an argument about why this is a choice to some degree. I think by wanting to bring the politics back in, you're also trying to say that rebels are doing this on purpose. So, so that, I think there are a lot of things you could do to make those, your argument about constituencies and the process of formation much more compelling and kind of stick with the urban-rural distinction. I feel like that's enough of a difference, but yeah.
Jesse, what's your finger?
Yeah, I mean, I read this paper before I think I might have been the impetus for the rebel splintering thing, because I realized I went through my old comments and I had said something about like, what about rebel splinters? So I apologize if I like created a bunch of new work for you all. But I think that does kind of open up the set of hypothesis 5 almost sets up a new set of questions for me that I want you to explore in more detail. So I'm kind of leaning towards, let's explain, okay, yeah, I liked the puzzle I think Janet had and Kathleen had suggested too, with like this, let's open with some cases, let's explore and take some qualitative dives into some cases, which I know you now have in the appendix, which is really useful and stuff like that. But I think, yeah, digging into that more and then saving because I think you actually have two types of rural formations of kind of groups growing out of rebel, past armed groups, which is the groups that are growing out of, that are splintering from active conflict. And that process is probably different from groups that are emerging from groups that have been defunct and there's still some grievance or some opportunity for them to emerge. So I think that hypothesis 5 setup is a little underdeveloped and there's a lot more that you could do with that. I would focus this on urban rebellion because I think that's a more compelling puzzle. And as Kathleen suggests, I think there's still, it's an opportunity for more new scholarship than like trying to take on the splintering stuff that people have kind of done or been doing. So yeah.
Janet, you can jump in.
Great. Yeah, this is really by way of brainstorming. So yes, I agree with what Kathleen and Jessica were saying, and you know, just one option would be to use case studies, right? Because hypothesis 1, 2, and 3 help us nail down something that's happening in urban areas, but right, they do imply something about rural areas, right? Which is that they're happening less often with political parties, interest groups, and military groups. And it occurred to me that so all of your case studies are oriented towards you know, showing the processes of urban formation through these groups. One option you could do is for some of them have a paired case of a rebel group that formed in these countries. I'd have to remember Brazzaville. I can't remember if Brazzaville would have also a rural insurgency during the period. It might, right? But actually, if you wanted to also through this paper shed a little light on, you know, sort of a negative case on what it might look like when groups don't form, you know, through organizations in urban areas, right? You could also do that through a case study, really just by means of brainstorming. It sounded like you didn't want to make too many additional changes to the paper at this point, and I actually think case studies just showing the processes of urban formation would be interesting enough. But that's another option for you. But I think just on that, I think you could call this paper The Origins of Urban Rebellion, or, if you wanted to, you could call it The Political Origins of Urban Rebellion, and focus on how your finding is showing that at least in urban rebellions, right, there seem to be these political foundations. And then you can say that you're leaving for future work to explore the ways in which we should think differently about rural rebellion. Is it less political? Is it political in different ways? Right, and you can just bracket that for future work, but that at a minimum, you're showing the political origins of urban rebellion.
Koren, Gary, back to you.
I'm trying to think. So a bit, Gary, do you have any? I find a lot of the comments are useful, some of the empirics. So if I can respond a couple of, so the ethnic we actually did, I did run the models with the home ethnic version as well. So then you get, 50% of the groups have some sort of, the results don't change. One thing we could do is interact, and I think we talked a bit about interaction with ethnic, but again, that would probably be something more different. But that might be interesting as well, right? Because you can think, maybe there's something about the moderation effect. Again, probably for a future paper. And then urban bias in general. So I think I did talk about it. Kalivas has, the security studies paper, there's a lot of that. The weird thing is when you focus on urban areas is you by definition kind of following urban bias. So, I don't know if there's a couple of maybe pointers of how we can head up some of those critiques as well. Because one of the things that worry me about is that then you give some reviewers the ammunition to basically say, oh, okay, you guys are just focusing on that urban stuff, and you admit that it's biased, and therefore your results kind of don't mean much. So, maybe a couple of pointers on those, how to kind of maybe think a bit about the urban bias within the framework of a paper that seems like from this discussion will be focused on urban formation.
Yeah, Janet?
Well, I think that's great. One thing to do is just, I think, look, saying, you can say it's very, by saying, look, there's at least some substantial portion of violence that's urban, and we really don't have any theories on it. Like, in my view, that's very constructive and an accurate way of going about it. And I also think, oh shoot, I just lost the point. Sorry, come back to me in a minute if someone else wants to jump in. I had a second and I thought more helpful point, but I lost it. Sorry, guys.
So I'll jump in for fun. I think it's a good concern. Like, if I had gotten this paper, I think I would be the kind of reviewer to be like, oh, well, you're just focusing on urban and then trying to explain what happened in only urban and not necessarily comparing it to other cases. So I think that's the right concern, but I don't know that you have to not do the paper on that in order to get over it. And I think you can do two things, which have kind of been brought up. But one, as everyone has said, you can use the literature to your advantage and say that here's what the theories say. They really focus on rural cases. How is that different than what we're arguing happens in urban environments? You can keep referencing that body of work without having to then show empirically that you're really trying to tackle both urban and rural and get into kind of the weeds on both. And I think the second thing is you could just be really honest and directly be as clear as possible about the potential problems with urban bias and have a section on that, in your discussion. And I do, sometimes you can invite more questions, but I've had mild success in doing that. And then, reviewers okay, they're very aware of this, and you tend to get people almost want to suggest more things of how to help that section rather than say, wow, they haven't thought of this at all. So those might be two ways that you could tackle that. Janet?
Yeah, I just thought of one other thing is you may be able to do some quick back of the envelope calculations and show, it would not surprise me if the more urban cases were more violent. So you could show that at least these are substantively important cases, or of course, it's like some of the cases you showed in your slides are clearly substantively important. One other idea I had is back to some of the conceptual issues that I and Kathleen, I think all of us raised earlier, is that Calibas and a lot of people have pointed out, and you point out that a lot of the fighting often happens in rural areas, right? But maybe if you wanted to, you could double down on this concept that initial formation is not something that everyone is focused on. And, at the very least, a lot of the organizations, the nonviolent organizations that become the basis for the groups, or the initial people come from urban areas, right? All of Che's FOCO groups in Latin America, right, initially came out of urban movements, right? A lot of the fighting happened in rural areas. So that's maybe one other way into this literature.
If there are no more comments on this particular thread, or Gary, you could respond again, or ask any other questions for the group that you have. And if you don't have any, we'll just open it up again for more points for the last 15 minutes.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's great. I mean, yeah, and another thing to say is that if there is urban bias, why don't we hear of all the actual violence that's happening there? It's another option. But no, those are really useful points. I mean, Gary, go ahead with your points as well.
Oh, thank you for all of this feedback. I think it's very helpful for us where we are in the paper. The only thing that I would ask further on at this point, and I'd love to leave time to hear more feedback, but one of the things that I struggle with in just talking about the paper is to be very, and I know maybe we're going to take politics a little bit to the back burner, but how that differs from where opportunity and grievance meet one another. Right? We think that this is different than just saying that you need both grievance and opportunity, but it's kind of hard to flesh out what that looks like as we're picturing this entrepreneur who is trying to rally individuals around them. I think this kind of ties into Jess's point about whether or not there's a group in a certain location that thus gives rise, or you have this individual who's doing it. For most of the cases that we looked at, it tends to be they're set in one location. Very, very rarely do you have the entrepreneur go elsewhere. So like Charles Taylor did, sure. But that doesn't seem to be the normal story. So just talking about how that process unfolds, do you think we do that clearly enough?
Yeah, Kathleen?
Yeah, I think this is a really good question for the paper. So I guess I think of grievance and opportunity as inherently political. I think one place where you are, or you have potential, I guess, to kind of move it forward would be to think about the behavior of the state. So like one thing that appears to be missing when we think a lot about grievance and opportunity is that they tend to be very static structural conditions, right? So do you have an opportunity structure constructed by your state institutions and the layout of ethnic groups or the history of grievance and inclusion? But there's not as much, I feel like, of the sort of politics of dynamic interaction, which I think may be a place where you are really centering on in a little bit of a hidden way when you talk about formation and potential movement of the insurgency to a place where they could fight. So one thing I think, or one way that you might think about this is as a sequenced process where you have formation and it's informed by some of the things that you already have in the paper, but then the states aren't doing nothing, right? So for example, you talked about like legal and illegal political parties. So you have like explicit pushing of these movements towards violence by delegitimizing them for nonviolent or conventional political behavior. That's just kind of one option. You may think about similar to Paul Thieneland's work on counterinsurgency, are they effective at pushing them out of the urban centers, right? Is that a product of the politics of what's going on? So that's kind of just one idea, I think, for for you to consider in thinking about what is it that you mean by politics. It is something more than the standard greed, grievance, opportunity, but where do you see the action happening? I mean, for me, politics means some kind of action. And where do you see that happening for this formation versus fighting process?
Any other comments on that particular line of inquiry? Okay, if not, and if Darian or y'all don't have anything else sort of pressing that you want to ask the group, I just say, does anyone have additional comments they kind of want to add so that the authors can collect them before we wrap up? Yeah, Janet?
I'll just say really, really small one. And for me, and I think this is coming from me because I don't know the Forge data quite as well as the other two discussants, which is just, I on measurement, I didn't quite understand how you are identifying the location of formation. And having done a little bit of work on it myself, I know it can be really hard. And it sounds like there's some ambiguity in the data. And so just, and maybe the answer was, it sounds like it's like Forge, or it was just coming from Forge, and you can just share a little bit about what Forge did. But I would want to know a little more about that in the next round of the paper.
Any other additional comments? Yeah, Kathleen.
Yeah, I will. I'll send you all my comments, but I wanted to bring one up on the empirics, which was using the control for relative strength. Again, thinking about this like dynamic process between opposition and the state and the formation process, the relative strength measure from the NSA data is almost static across groups. And that really reflects something that I think has happened after formation. And I wonder if you had thought about that at all, or if you thought it caused any issues for the analysis that you're essentially capturing like post-formation group strength.
I mean, are we responding, or is this just comments?
Yeah, it's up to you. You can do quick responses.
I mean, I think it's a great point, right? Because it does, in a way, reflect post-formation issues. So as we mentioned, right, our data is cross-sectional. We don't really have variation over time. So like what we can capture as dynamic is limited. If this was the main explanatory variable, yeah, it wouldn't fly. In this case, the idea is more like those theories that suggest there's something about those capacities, right, would expect that shapes the formation as well. So because we're looking at because we're looking at it cross-sectional, then it fits as kind of a control just to say, look, it's not just this rebel group suddenly have all this funding and that's why they choose to form or something like that. It's not perfect, obviously, right? Which is why we kind of run robust models that don't include those measures as well, just to show that it doesn't really alter the result.
Yeah. So let me admit that I read the appendix very quickly and there was a lot in there. So maybe you already did this. And I think it relates to something Jessica mentioned earlier, but I wonder if you can't assess the time from formation to like consistent battle deaths of some threshold as a way to assess early strength. So, if we identify a group or, in the case, I think we relied also on UCDP, identified an incompatibility, we see the parent organization is active for 10 years or 20 years or 5 years, right? That may suggest something about the startup power of the group. Just one possibility.
No,
It's
a good point. I mean, I think it makes perfect sense. It's something that, I mean, my hunch would be there's a huge variation probably. Some groups, form and immediately fights. Other might kind of, especially the more kind of older communist anti-colonial groups, probably takes much longer.
Yeah, I think if I could just jump in quickly, basically all of your, and this might be problematic because of the types of groups that you're looking at. Well, maybe not, but the military factions fight pretty much right away. And part of that is like trying to figure out if there was a lot of coup plotting happening like months and months before. Usually like it's pretty much, there are like tacit conversations, but thinking about an organization that stages a coup, that happens really quickly. A lot of the like armed wings of parties, groups that grow out of parties aren't necessarily fighting a civil war right away. They're not necessarily wanting to do that. They might be perpetrating some terrorist attacks or something like that. But I think there you have very different data generating processes that lead to the armed groups. And so that time to onset of conflict in UCDP is kind of necessarily different based on the like almost like the purposes of those organizations that we're looking at their formation. So I think it is an interesting idea as like as a auxiliary kind of supplementary test to this, but yeah, I wish I had a better suggestion beyond the relative strength, but I would be a little, if I were a reviewer, I'd be a little concerned about that time to rebellion, only because it's so different. Not to like fight with my co-author on this or anything. I think it's an interesting idea. It's probably, it is worth considering.
Yeah, I mean,
having also tried to explore that a little bit empirically in a paper that I'm currently working on, the kind of the formation then time to onset. So yeah, it's tough. There's a lot of variation in groups and like how long it takes them to make it into UCDP.
I mean, one idea might be to just really look at the kind of the difference, because it shouldn't be too long, like to look between like the difference between the formation and when they recorded UCDP, and then just kind of collapse it by those categories, right? Because as you said, and then we can say, look, there's there, and then use the case studies maybe to flush some of those differences. Yeah, that's a good point. Good idea.
Yeah, there also might be just something systematic about the different types and patterns of formation, even within these urban groups, that are driven by their group type and how fast they have to fight, right? The military, maybe secrets spread faster than elsewhere. Or to use Janet's language, rumors, right? So anyway, I think this is a good point, and maybe it actually factors into formation more so than just a control or something like that.
And I guess kind of in line with Kathleen's logic here, like if you're looking at a military faction, you don't have to train a bunch of soldiers how to fight. Like they know how to fight. But if you're training a bunch of party supporters how to fight, then that might require a bit more time to amass arms and go through training, and like at least anecdotally that does there are some people that already know how to fight within those party organizations, but it does kind of, the logistical challenges do require usually a bit more groundwork before we can see the onset of 25 battle death conflict. So yeah no, I think okay, maybe I'm coming around to that as an option.
That reminds me of the old like the crime story of recruitment from Gambetta and others, that there's this population of folks who are fighting in wars and are there and are available to fight in some other version of organized armed conflict. So that actually really makes a lot of sense, Jess. We got a discussion going. You see that? It was magic on Zoom. So we do technically usually stop in just a couple more minutes, or now it's really up to y'all. If anyone has additional pressing comments they want to share, that will be recorded. Please unmute yourself and jump in. And if not, I will give our concluding comments. I think y'all got a lot of great feedback from today's workshop, and it was really fun. So before I do my spiel, any final pressing wishes to speak?
So yeah, I agree. We got great comments. Just one last point on the missingness. So I've been actually matching some mass skilling data to that, to Forge stuff, to look at that aspect as well, maybe down the line.
Sorry.
I think the missingness is actually.
Sorry, or I just wanted to hear what you said, and it went out. You said you've been matching
my internet
something data, or at least I couldn't hear what you said. You match something data to. Will you just rewind 5 seconds? Thanks.
Oh, so am I back, or is my internet not functioning?
You're good. You're good. Yeah, we can see and hear you.
Yeah, Bloomington internet has been acting out a bit. There's not enough capacity for everybody's running it. And anyway, so what I was saying is, I've been matching Forge data to mass skilling data. There is a recent data released by researchers at ANU. So I've been doing some of the matching, and again, some of the categories, because militias and rebel groups sometimes are hard to kind of, but it seems like there is quite a bit of overlap between the groups, so that's good. And another thing is that any variation seems to be, I wouldn't say completely at random, but probably, definitely at the kind of more random level. I didn't know, again, that's just a descriptive reading, but I didn't notice anything systematic. And I don't think they use UCDP. I think they go by different kind of original data set. So that's a good point in terms of the potential missingness. Again, this is not any systematic evaluation, right? But it does seem like the groups that are there we capture most of the relevant groups, which is good.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for making time, especially when now these Zoom calls are more popular than ever. We really appreciate it, and we really find that these workshops help people with their papers, and they are watched. We had like an average, I think, of 100 views per video last year, which is great. I was gonna say surprising, but I'm I'm not, because it's great and we're awesome and we do good work. So my concluding comments are, thank you everyone. And if you'd like to watch your own presentation, again, this will be posted via YouTube and also posted to the Peace Science Society website. You can click around and find the Colloquium tab. Also, for you to spread the word to your friends and colleagues and students, we will have our last OPSC presentation of this semester on May 15th. Yael Zira and Alexandra Siegel will be talking to us about their paper, and I will be there again. So please spread the word, and thank you so much for coming. We really, really appreciate your time, and thank you for bringing us this great paper. Warren, Gary, good luck with all of your revisions. So thanks, everyone.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you very much. Yeah.